Hello folks, I'm Trev Makes It Easy, the channel where we make learning easy. In this series, Trev on Econ, I'll be taking you through topics you're likely to run into in any introductory course in economics at the college or university level. My goal is to make economics less scary, more approachable, and, if I can, mildly enjoyable. With that being said, let's make it easy. All right, folks, let's get started. Today we're going to continue our discussion about inflation by diving a little deeper into the specifics of how inflation is calculated, especially here in Canada. Now, this does apply to other countries as well, but you may see minor regional differences depending on your own country. So, in Canada, we measure inflation quite frequently. It usually comes out every month. Now, we talked in the last video about the idea of price levels, and when we calculate inflation, it's important that we have sort of an agreed upon price level that we're going to use to compare year over year. Now in Canada, we use something called the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index. And what this is going back to kind of something we talked about in the last video. This is a basket of goods and services that the average urban consumer purchases. Okay, that is the technical that's the technical definition. Now, why urban? The main reason is the urban, criteria means that you live in a city of over 100,000 people. Now, why is that important? Well, that does cover about, I think it's like over 80% of the people in Canada, so it's a very good set of the data. But it also excludes a lot of people who might have very unique needs. All right. Particularly those in the country are going to have very different buying habits than those in the city, simply due to personal needs, what's available to them, what they have access to, those kinds of things. Now, in terms of the goods and services, it's basically what you would assume to see in your own personal budget. The biggest categories tend to be things like housing is probably the biggest, food, transportation. You might also see things like healthcare or personal care. There's all sorts of categories. And each one is basically given a percentage, all right, or again, what we think we are going to buy. And these are different weights that are applied to them. And if you've studied math at all, you might remember the term weighted average. And that's kind of like what we do here with this CPI business, okay? We do care about certain things more than others, all right? So if the cost of, let's say, something in personal care, shampoo goes up, that hurts, but we're talking about something that, might be $10, $20, maybe $50 if you're a really fancy shampoo. But when we talk about something like rent or mortgage, a 10% or, something more moderate, a 5% increase to your rent, that's massive. And you're definitely going to feel that. And this actually kind of relates to a topic called elasticity, which we'll talk more about in micro videos. But we are just sensitive to certain price changes more so than others due to size. So more important things are given more weight. All right. Now, what I'd like to do is basically show you a little example of how this works. How do we go from stuff I buy to what is the inflation rate? Now, we're going to keep it simple. All right. We are going to buy some goods. We're going to buy, for example, apples and bananas because I'm a little hungry and those start with A and B. So you'll remember when we did the GDP videos, we actually did something very similar to this. And the idea is that we can take different quantities. So like 2012 Q, 2012 P. We can do 2024 Q, 2024 P. Again, this is very similar to what we did in a previous video, but that's actually kind of the point. And we'll do 2025 just to, kill your time a little more. But it is good practice. Okay, so here's my pretty table that I definitely should have made beforehand, but hey, we're here now. Pretty good. So let's say, in 2012, we bought 3 apples and 2 bananas. They were each $4. Then in 2024, we bought 4 and 3, and they went to $4 and $5. And then bananas got really expensive. They went up to $8. Apples went up to $6. Bad year in 2025. And we bought, I don't know, 6 and 10. Okay. If you go back again to GDP, this is a very similar table to what we worked with there. So first things first. Step 1, we want to find the value of the basket in each year. Okay, so we're going to do a lot of P times Q. But, and we're going to throw this bad boy in red, however, the basket quantities are fixed to the base year. Okay, this is something we kind of saw again back in GDP. Remember when we did real GDP and we said, oh, in real GDP, we keep base year prices, but then current year quantities. CPI is basically the reverse, okay? Or at least to get to CPI, it's the reverse. So we are going to use fixed quantities, but allow the price to change. And it's because, well, we're interested in price changes. So we can actually, just quickly, we know we won't care about this. We know we won't care about this because we will always be using this quantity. Okay? We want the quantity to stay consistent. And the reason is if we start changing the quantities, then maybe it's production that's changing. That's a whole separate issue. We want to focus in on the piece we need. So how do we do this? Well, what we're going to do is basically just P times Q. So basket value 2012. Well, we are going to have 3 times 4 plus 2 times 4. And that's going to give me what? 12 plus 8, 20. $20. Okay. Now, quick note, this is not CPI yet. This is just the value of the basket. How much did the basket cost me? Basket value 2024. Well, same idea. Again, this time though, still keeping those prices. So, those quantities. So 3 times the new price of 4 plus still 2 times the new price of 5, which is 3 times 4 is 12 plus 10. So what, 22? Okay. So again, not CPI, just the value of the basket. And then finally, we have basket value in 2025. Same idea. We are going to go, okay, still 3 apples, but they're $6 now, plus 2 bananas, but they are $8 now. So 3 times 6 is 18, plus 2 times 8 is 16. 18 plus 16 is 34. My mental math is not great, but I'm pretty sure that's right. 34, right? Step 2 is now we have to find CPI, okay? Use these basket values to find CPI in each year. So obviously the question becomes, well, what is CPI? CPI is a very simple formula. CPI is equal to value of basket in current year, so whatever year you're looking at, divided by the value of the basket in the base year. And then, of course, the ever-beloved times 100, just to make it a number. So now we can take these values up here and work with those. So let's go take CPI for 2012. Well, in the current year, it's worth $20 because I'm looking at 2012. And in the base year, Well, it's still 2012, so it's 20 divided by 20 times 100. We get 100. And if you remember back to some of the things we did in GDP, there was a thing called the GDP deflator, and it also said the base year was 100. The reason is this is an index number. The base year is always 100. Okay? This is a small thing, but it'll sometimes save you a little bit of work, so it's worth doing. What about 2024? Well, 2024, well, now the CPI, or the value of the basket in the current year, is 22, divided by the base year basket, which is still the 2012 value, which was 20, times 100 equals, it's probably going to be like 104. My math is bad, so we're going to pull up a quick calculator. 22 divided by 20 times 100. 110. That makes more sense, actually. And then one more time, 2025 is 34 divided by 20 times 100. It's going to be a big number, probably. 170. Right? These are my CPIs. These are my consumer price indexes, hence why it's an index number. And these are a measure of the price level when we consider, again, the average urban consumer's purchases. Okay? We are still not done. Okay? And I'll quickly write this here because people always get this wrong. CPI is not inflation. Okay? I don't know why. I mean, I know why, but people love to make this mistake. It's not the same thing. All right. What we need instead is to now do the final step, which is step 3, calculate inflation. Now, inflation, we've actually seen this formula before. Okay. It's the percentage change formula. So inflation is going to be current year CPI minus old year CPI, just whatever the previous year is or whatever year you're comparing to, divided by old year CPI. And then, of course, everyone's favorite, times 100. So, very similar. And again, we've seen this formula before. It's one you will use all the time in macro. So let's do a couple things. The first thing is inflation from 2012 to 2024. Well, in 2024, the current year, it's 110 minus the base year, which is 100, divided by the base year, or the old year in this case, which is 100. It doesn't have to be the base year, as we'll see later, but in this case, the old year is the base year, times 100, which equals 10%. Now, quick reminder, when you are doing this formula with the base year, the 100 index number, you can just subtract. So 110 minus 100 is 10. In fact, when we go to do this for 2012 to 2025, we could just do 170 minus 100 is 70%. I promise you, you can try it yourself, plug in the full equation and see that, well, guess what? It works out fine. Where you 100% need the equation is when you don't have the base year involved. So the inflation from 2024 to 2025, if I just subtract them and do 170 minus 110, I'd get 60. That is going to be wrong. Okay, so we need to do it properly. So 170 minus 110 divided by 110 times 100. I'm going to pull up my calculator for this one. 170 minus 110 divided by 110. It's about 54.5%. Right? It's not that full 60. All right, it's a little different. So again, be careful of this. This is why I tend to tell students always just use the formula. Just get in the habit that if you're doing inflation, you want to use the formula, even if it's sometimes easier just to subtract. It's not that much quicker, so it's probably not the biggest deal. All right. So what we saw is between 2012 and 2024, inflation went up 10%. Then between 2012 and 2025, it was up 70%, but most of that came between 2024 and 2025, where it went up 54.5%. All right. Again, these things fluctuate. Now, these are crazy high inflation rates, but they are things that can happen. Hopefully not, but it can happen. One thing I want to quickly point out, and this is just a kind of a test trick that I see people run into a lot, is that note a lower inflation does not mean prices have dropped. Okay. So what do I mean by that? If 1 year the inflation is 5% and the next year it's 3%, so it's a less inflation rate, prices have still gone up, just at a slower rate. Okay. For them to actually go down, inflation has to be negative. Okay, not just lower, negative. All right, you would see a -10 or a -70 or something like that. Again, it seems like a small thing, but it does matter quite a bit. All right, this type of question is very common on tests. I would definitely spend some time practicing. Use AI to give you example problems, but this is something you will want to have a hold of. Now, one thing I like to do with all these measurements is, why is it not perfect? Okay, so we call these problems with CPI. It has biases. Okay, biases meaning that these are things that it doesn't fully account for, and because of that, it is not perfectly accurate of the real world. The first one is what's called substitution bias. Okay, and there's lots of these. I'm going to list probably the main 4, I would say, but you could probably extend this further with like really niche things. Substitution bias is this. Since the basket stays constant, it doesn't account for the fact that people will substitute to other goods when they get too expensive. All right. So an example of this is a lot of food has this problem. So let's say that the basket says we buy 5 pounds of beef and 5 pounds of chicken, right? That means every time they measure the basket, it's 5 and 5. But what if the price of beef skyrockets, right? Well, I just might not buy beef anymore. I might buy like 1 pound of beef and 9 pounds of chicken. I'm going to change my buying habits to reflect that, yeah, one thing has gotten more expensive. I'm going to go buy the cheaper thing, or at least the thing that's cheaper relative. And again, the basket just can't handle this because it just knows you buy 5 and 5. It can't account for the fact that you will actually switch it up. The second one is quality change bias. All right. It's hard to measure improvements in quality. All right. And these can raise the price to compensate for it. So, a computer in the 90s versus a computer today, very different qualities. Probably similar-ish prices if you like adjust for inflation, all that good stuff. But how do you deal with that, right? How do you deal with the fact that, this thing might just be more expensive because we have much better parts in it now, or much more advanced parts in it? There are some methods they can do. There's something called like hedonic adjustments. We're not going to get into that. But basically, they can break some of these purchases down in their components and try and estimate like which of the components has risen in quality, and then try and compensate for that. It's not easy to do, but this is why this is a bias we tend to see. The other big one, new goods bias. All right. Again, since the basket stays constant, it doesn't adjust when people start buying new things. A perfect example of this was a few years ago, marijuana became legal in Canada. Before it was legal, I'm sure people still bought it, but the CPI couldn't account for it because it's an illegal good at the time. But once it became legal and became a very commonly used product, right, they had to sort of figure out a way to deal with that. In fact, they eventually had to amend the basket for CPI to include an allowance for marijuana consumption. All right. In Canada's CPI, we do have a small percentage that is for marijuana because it is so commonplace. Now, this is a hard one because sometimes things are fads where like we buy them and it looks like, oh, maybe this is the new thing. And then no one buys it ever again. But then there are things like marijuana or maybe like AI subscriptions that the CPI basket wasn't aware of, but might actually become sort of normal purchases for the average household. Again, this means that the basket just has to be updated sometimes, but then you get into the issue of you're not comparing apples to apples because you have one basket with these goods, one basket with these goods. They're no longer the same. Again, it produces some bias. All right. The last thing is something called outlet bias, and that is the fact that humans try to find deals on things. All right. CPI uses retail pricing. So CPI to find their prices, they tend to use like metropolitan area prices, which again might not be indicative of everyone's buying habits. And it also doesn't account for the fact that people like to find deals. We use point systems, coupons, sales, whatever the case may be. The name is outlet bias because of things like outlet stores where you can go buy cheaper products. But again, it's similar to substitution in the fact that people adapt their behavior to avoid paying full price. All of this is to say CPI probably overestimates inflation. All right. And what I mean by that is that because CPI can't capture all of these different things where you and I are making adjustments within our own life to battle inflation, the inflation we experience as individuals is probably less than what CPI predicts. Now, how much is that? It's probably not a massive amount. My guess would be like 1%. But that does mean that if inflation is quoted at like 4%, it might only be 3 or maybe even less for us as individuals because of how we've changed our habits. All right. Again, with all economic measures, it's important to know why they're useful, but also important to know that they have limitations and genuine critiques that mean we can't just take them at face value and assume they're correct. The last thing I want to quickly talk about is overall, why do we measure this stuff? Okay, why measure inflation? And there's a couple different things. Obviously, a big one is keep track of economic variables, right? We want to have as much data as possible. We want to know how the economy is doing. So we probably want to know what prices are doing. So that's probably just a good idea in general. But a big one is going to be adjusting wages and pensions, right? We might call these cost of living adjustments. A lot of long-term contracts, again, especially around wages and pensions, have some built-in what's called COLA, cost of living adjustment, where every year it goes up by some percentage to try and match expected inflation or inflation up to a point, depends how it's set up, but they adjust to reflect the change in inflation. So we need to have as accurate measurement of inflation as we can so that we can adjust people's wages and pensions to match that. And it's important because if you don't keep up with inflation, you technically are able to buy less each year as inflation goes up. For example, if I make $100 this year and can buy $100 worth of stuff, cool. But if next year I still make $100, but now I can only buy I don't know, $80 worth of stuff because inflation ate my purchasing power, right? I've actually lost money in a sense, right? My money is less powerful than it was last year, which is really a big setback. Another big one is guidance for the central bank. This is particularly again in Canada, and monetary policy. We're going to see in a much later video that the central bank really wants to make sure that inflation is at a stable percentage. I've kind of alluded to it already, but in Canada, we try to target 2% inflation. So we need to measure inflation to make sure we're doing that. If we're not, that's when things like monetary policy come into play, and we start to realize, hey, we might have to make some changes, or we might have to adjust things in the economy to try and get back to a healthier spot. The other thing is that it does plays a role in tax brackets. Okay. We're not going to get too much into this because honestly, taxes bore me, but it does play a small role in tax brackets and benefits around tax brackets, and how much money you make and all that fun stuff. It's important. Not in my brain because, again, I do not think taxes are interesting, necessary, but not interesting. But the idea here is that inflation is a very important metric to keep track of. In my mind, it's probably, I might argue it's the most important, simply because on an individual basis, it's the one we feel the most, right? If GDP is doing well, cool. You might feel it, you might not. If unemployment is high, again, you might feel it, you might not. If you have a job, you're like, who cares? I don't notice. But inflation is something that is very difficult to avoid. Or if you are able to avoid it, you're probably adjusting your behavior in certain ways to try and avoid it. And because of that, inflation is something we all feel. I know at time of recording this in early 2026 that we're definitely feeling it, especially in Canada and other parts of the world. So it's important to understand, because then we know how to potentially address it later on. And that will be a video we make at some point about how we can use policy and things to reduce the inflation rate or keep it under control. But that's a ways down the line. With that being said, that wraps up our lesson on inflation. Again, a very important variable, one of those ones you hear about a lot in the news, and one that, again, is going to impact you in a day-to-day situation. With that being said, I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye. Well, folks, that wraps up another lesson for today. I hope it was helpful. If you found the video valuable, please make sure to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions about the content or requests for other topics or subjects you'd like me to cover, please leave a comment below. Until next time, keep learning and make it easy.